She didn't want to be beautiful. She just wanted to be seen. Every day. Charlotte Bennett walked into Stone Capital, quietly efficient and quietly invisible. Not because she lacked talent, not because she lacked heart, but because somewhere between loss, loyalty, and life, she forgot she mattered. Until the day her name, not her title, was called. Until the moment he, the man everyone noticed, turned toward the woman no one did and asked her to be his date. What would you do if one simple invitation held the power to rewrite how you see yourself? This story isn't about a makeover. It's about a becoming years in the making. If you've ever longed to be truly seen, like, comment, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Now, let's begin. A secretary's stunning dinner transformation left a millionaire speechless. You can work in the same office for 6 years and still feel like a stranger. Charlotte Bennett knew that truth more intimately than she cared to admit. At 32, she had long since mastered the rhythm of invisibility. She arrived at Stone Capital each weekday morning at precisely 7:30 a.m., just as the janitor was finishing the lobby floors and the sun cast long shadows against the Dallas skyline. Her entrance was always quiet, no flashy heels, no jangling jewelry, no greetings loud enough to echo off the marble walls. She preferred it that way, or at least, that's what she told herself. Her desk sat near the executive wing, tucked just outside the glass-paneled doors of Ethan Stone's office. From that perch, Charlotte managed the calendar of one of the most powerful men in the city, fielded emails at lightning speed, coordinated client dinners, remembered birthdays no one else bothered to, and ensured that Ethan's day flowed without friction. Everyone relied on her, but no one truly saw her. She wore simple cardigans, muted blouses, and her signature navy pencil skirt that fit just well enough without calling attention. Her hair was always tied back, never down. Glasses rested low on her nose. She blended in like the wallpaper, just how most people seem to prefer. Except, of course, when something went wrong. That morning, she sat at her desk sipping lukewarm coffee from the chipped mug she kept hidden behind her monitor. The office was slowly coming to life, the shuffle of footsteps, the faint hum of printers, someone microwaving eggs down the hall. Charlotte opened Ethan's calendar and began rearranging meetings with the precision of a chess master. He had 2 investor calls, 1 internal strategy meeting, and a final prep session for the Southern Legacy Gala, a massive charity event that every major figure in Texas real estate would be attending. It was her job to make sure his schedule looked effortless, though it never was. At exactly 8 n.m., she rose, straightened her cardigan, and knocked softly on the frosted glass door. "Come in," came the familiar, cool voice from within. Charlotte entered, holding his leather-bound planner in one hand and a fresh cup of dark roast in the other 2 sugars. Splash of oat milk, 195 degrees exactly, just the way he liked it. "Good morning." "Mr. Stone," she said, placing the coffee on his desk and opening the planner to that day's itinerary. "Your 8:30 call with Sterling Partners is confirmed. I moved the internal review to noon, per your preference for fewer morning meetings." Ethan didn't look up from his laptop. He rarely did. "Fine," he replied, reaching for the coffee without glancing at her. "No thank you. No acknowledgement. Just another day." Charlotte turned to leave, already mentally drafting an email to the catering team for Saturday's event. But she paused when Ethan's phone buzzed, sharp and urgent. He answered, and the change in his voice was immediate. "What do you mean he canceled?" There was a long pause. Family emergency. This close to the gala, Charlotte hesitated, one foot still in the office, unsure whether to stay. Ethan ended the call with a tight exhale, his jaw clenched. He stood slowly, crossing the room in a way that felt purposeful. "My guest for Saturday," he said finally, just backed out. Charlotte shifted slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that. I can't go alone. It's not just optics, it's a signal. These events matter." Charlotte nodded. She knew the significance of appearances in their world. She had spent the past 2 weeks helping him prepare arranging seating charts, drafting speech notes, even selecting tie colors that wouldn't clash with the backdrop. He could ask anyone. Hire someone, even. There were entire services for that. Ethan stared at his planner for a moment, then did something unexpected. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in what felt like years, Charlotte wasn't sure what he saw. Then came the words, measured, direct, unmistakable. "I need you to accompany me this Saturday." Her breath caught. She blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. Had he just asked her? "Sir," she managed, "you've already worked on the prep. You know the guest list. You can handle any conversation that might arise." It makes sense. It did make sense, logically, efficiently. But Charlotte's mind was already spiraling. She didn't own anything suitable for a black tie event. She hadn't worn a dress in years. She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked her to be seen rather than to stay in the background. She opened her mouth to respond but found no words. Ethan had already returned to his seat, typing as if nothing unusual had transpired. Charlotte stood there for another beat, planner still clutched to her chest. For 6 years she had moved through these halls like a shadow. And now, for reasons she didn't yet understand, someone had turned on the light. Sometimes, the person you least expect is the one who saves the night. Charlotte sat still for a long moment after Ethan's words faded into the quiet hum of his office. The clatter of keys resumed, the world continued, but something in her had shifted. "I need you to accompany me this Saturday." The sentence looped in her head like a soft echo. It felt less like an invitation, and more like a test. By the time she returned to her desk, her fingers were trembling ever so slightly as they hovered above the keyboard. She typed out an email draft without looking at the screen. Her mind wasn't in the room anymore. Instead, it wandered back to the mirror in her tiny apartment bathroom, where she often caught glimpses of herself in the early hours. Tired eyes, hair thrown into the same bun she wore every weekday, that plain gray cardigan she always reached for because it never made a statement. She never meant to disappear. But between taking care of her younger brother after their mother's sudden stroke, leaving graduate school just months before graduation, and settling for stability over ambition, Charlotte had slowly tucked pieces of herself away, a little at a time, until the woman she once dreamed of becoming felt like a story she'd read about someone else. And now here was Ethan Stone, the last person she ever expected to notice her asking her to be seen. In public. At the most high-profile gala of the year. The logical part of her brain knew why he had asked. It made sense. She knew the guest list. She could keep up with the conversations. She was safe, professional, predictable. But the rest of her, the quiet ache she carried, couldn't help but wonder what else had flickered across his eyes when he looked at her that morning. Still, her first instinct was to say no. No. Thank you. I'm just the assistant. I'm not that kind of woman. The kind that walks into a ballroom and turns heads. The kind that knows how to carry herself in heels and silk. She didn't own anything remotely close to formal wear. The last dress she bought was for her cousin's wedding 4 years ago, and it was more business casual than black tie. Charlotte bit her lower lip, closing the email draft without saving. Across the room, someone laughed two junior analysts gossiping by the copy machine. They hadn't noticed her walking in earlier. They never did. She looked down at her blouse, white, buttoned to the top, no jewelry. Was this who she really was, or just who she had become to survive that night? She sat at her small kitchen table, phone in hand, scrolling aimlessly through photos from past galas. Images of women in stunning gowns, hair perfectly swept, their expressions radiant, poised. And yet, beneath the sparkle and flash, she saw something else, confidence, presence, not perfection. Grace, her oldest friend and former college roommate, called just as she was about to shut off her phone. "You okay?" Grace asked, sensing something in her voice. "You sound floaty." Charlotte chuckled softly. "I think I've been invited to a black tie gala." A pause. "Wait, what? By who? Ethan Stone?" The gasp on the other end of the line was so loud Charlotte had to hold the phone away. "Charlotte, the Ethan Stone. Are you messing with me?" "I wish I were," she said, swirling the tea in her mug. "His original guest canceled. He asked me to go with him. Said it made sense, given the guest list." Grace paused again. Then, quieter. "And how do you feel about that?" Charlotte stared out the window. The sun had dipped below the buildings, casting long, sleepy shadows across her living room. She thought of all the times she'd sat in that exact chair, watching life go by, convincing herself she didn't want more. "I feel terrified," she whispered. "Like I'm about to walk into a room that was never built for someone like me." Grace's voice was steady. "Then maybe it's time to redesign the room." The next morning, Charlotte walked 2 blocks past her usual coffee shop, past the public library, and stopped outside a little boutique tucked between a flower shop and an antique store. It had no flashing sign, just a simple display window, and inside that window, a dress, midnight blue, structured bodice, soft drape at the waist, elegant, understated, almost like it was waiting for her. She'd passed by this boutique many times before, back when she was in grad school, back when she used to dream about one day buying a dress not because she needed it, but because she deserved to wear something beautiful. Charlotte stood there for a full minute, her heart pounding. She reached for the doorknob. Tomorrow, everything might change. It's not about becoming someone else. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you to hide. Charlotte hesitated at the door of the boutique, her hand resting lightly on the brass handle. The morning sun reflected in the glass, throwing her image back at her, a small figure in a tired gray cardigan and worn flats. Her hair pulled back tight, glasses slightly slipping on the bridge of her nose. A woman, functional, efficient, invisible. She took a breath and pushed the door open. A soft chime rang overhead as she stepped inside. The boutique smelled faintly of sandalwood and lavender. It was quiet, but not sterile warm, like a whisper of an old memory. Racks of dresses lined the walls in carefully chosen colors, nothing garish, nothing trendy. Just grace, fabric that flowed, styles that whispered rather than shouted. Charlotte stood near the doorway for a moment, unsure of where to begin. "Looking for something special," came a voice from behind a curtain. A woman emerged, perhaps in her mid-50s, silver hair cut into a graceful bob, wearing a navy wrap dress that looked both timeless and lived in. Her eyes were kind, knowing. Charlotte smiled nervously. "Yes, I think so. I have an event." The woman nodded, as if she already understood more than what was said. "You have the look of someone attending something important, but mostly of someone who doesn't want to be the center of attention." "That obvious," Charlotte replied, managing a quiet laugh. The woman smiled. "Not obvious. Familiar." "I'm Eleanor." Charlotte, let's find something that lets you show up, not just your clothing." Charlotte followed her through the boutique like someone stepping into a different life. They passed velvet and satin, sequins and silk. Eleanor didn't rush. She watched Charlotte's face as she held up each piece, looking for something behind her eyes, not approval recognition. They tried a burgundy column dress first, too bold. A pale silver gown with a halter neck, too young. A navy chiffon with embroidered sleeves, too safe. Each time, Charlotte would emerge from the dressing room and glance at herself in the mirror. She stood stiff, unsure, pulling at the fabric. She didn't know how to be in these dresses. They weren't hers. And then Eleanor pulled one last garment from a separate rack. It was a simple black gown, midnight in tone, not glossy, not matte. It had a structured bodice and a soft flare at the hem, delicate sleeves that just barely touched the shoulder. Understated, elegant, unassuming, until it wasn't. "Try this one," Eleanor said softly. "It doesn't demand attention. It waits for you to own it." Charlotte stepped into the changing room and slowly slipped into the dress. When she emerged, something shifted. Eleanor didn't speak. She simply nodded toward the three-way mirror. Charlotte turned, uncertain at first. Her hands fidgeted at her sides. She reached up to tuck a loose strand of hair back, but it had fallen in soft waves around her shoulders, having slipped from the bun she had worn all morning. And then she looked, really looked. She stared at the woman in the mirror, not a stranger, but someone long buried beneath the routines, the responsibilities, the endless roles she had played for everyone but herself. Gone was the cardigan armor. Gone were the glasses that blurred more than corrected. Her face, even without makeup, had a quiet glow. Her shoulders, usually hunched forward from years of avoiding notice, now pulled back, almost instinctively. She looked beautiful, not in the way magazines promised, but in a way that felt earned, real. Her eyes glistened. "I haven't seen her in a long time," Charlotte whispered. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She's always been here, waiting for you to look." Charlotte nodded, trying to swallow the knot rising in her throat. The moment held stillness, gravity, a tender undoing. In the mirror, the woman staring back wasn't trying to be someone else. She wasn't pretending. She was reclaiming. Charlotte stepped closer to the glass. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached up and gently took off her glasses. She blinked once, twice. Without the frames, her features softened. Her eyes, hazel with flecks of green, seemed clearer, braver. She reached for the lip balm Eleanor had set nearby and dabbed a hint of color on her lips. Rosewood, barely there. And then the tears came, quietly, not from sadness, but from recognition, from the aching joy of remembering that somewhere beneath the girl who dropped out of school, the woman who blended into conference rooms, the sister who carried everyone else's weight, there still lived a version of her who dreamed, not of fairy tales, but of being seen, fully, unapologetically. Eleanor handed her a box of tissues without a word. Charlotte laughed through her tears. "I didn't think buying a dress would be this emotional." "It's not the dress," Eleanor said gently. "It's what you're ready to allow yourself to feel in it." Charlotte nodded, holding the edge of the fabric between her fingers. She didn't want to take it off. She wasn't sure she ever could go back to the old clothes again, but it wasn't just the fabric. It was what the mirror had finally shown her. She hadn't disappeared. She had just paused. And now she was pressing play. What if the whole room turned, not because of what you wore, but because of who you finally let them see? The lights of the ballroom shimmered like stars had been coaxed down from the sky and strung along every crystal fixture. Soft music floated through the air, violins warming up in the far corner. Clinking glasses, murmured laughter, the rustle of gowns sweeping across polished floors. Charlotte stood at the edge of it all, just inside the grand entrance of the Southern Legacy Gala, arm lightly linked through Ethan's. She wasn't sure if it was her breath that caught, or the room's. In the span of a heartbeat, she felt it heads turning, conversations pausing mid-sentence, eyes scanning toward her, not in judgment, not with disdain, but in wonder. For a moment, Charlotte wanted to shrink old habits tugging at her like threads unraveling. But then Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. His gaze traveled across her face, her softly curled hair framing her cheekbones, the delicate neckline of her black dress, the way her emerald earrings caught the light. And something in his eyes shifted. Not surprise, not shock, but realization, as if he were seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. "You look," he began, then stopped. Charlotte smiled gently. "It's okay. You don't have to find the words." But he held her gaze. "No, I do. You look like you've arrived." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. They stepped forward together, crossing the marbled floor. The ballroom opened like a dream, chandeliers glowing above, guests mingling near tables dressed in white linens and golden light. Waiters moved gracefully between clusters of conversation, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Charlotte took it all in with a quiet kind of awe, not from the grandeur, but from the strange calm blooming in her chest. She belonged here, not because of the dress, not because of the man beside her, but because she had stopped apologizing for taking up space. They made their way toward a small gathering of investors and board members, faces Charlotte knew from countless memos and meetings, but who had never once looked her in the eye before. Tonight was different. Mr. Stone, one man greeted with a firm handshake. "And, forgive me, but I don't believe we've met," before Ethan could speak. Charlotte extended her hand with a gracious smile. "Charlotte Bennett, executive assistant at Stone Capital." The man blinked, then chuckled, clearly caught off guard. "I must say, you carry yourself more like a partner than an assistant." Charlotte tilted her head, still smiling. "Maybe I've just had good mentors." Laughter rippled through the small group. Within minutes, Charlotte found herself gliding between conversations, confident, composed, and full of quiet charm. She spoke about upcoming projects with insight, asked thoughtful questions, even shared a memory or two about the firm's early struggles that had the group listening with new respect. Ethan stood just behind her most of the time, but not in the way men sometimes stand beside women at events like these, possessively or protectively. He stood like someone who was watching something rare unfold. Something he hadn't expected, but couldn't look away from. At one point, he leaned in slightly, his voice low near her ear. "You're extraordinary tonight." Charlotte turned, amusement dancing in her eyes. Tonight, he gave a half smile. "You know what I mean." She did, and yet something about the way he said it stirred something deeper. Later in the evening, the orchestra began its first slow number, a classic, lilting waltz that filled the ballroom with a kind of timeless elegance. Couples began drifting to the floor. Ethan extended his hand. "Would you dance with me?" Charlotte hesitated, not out of fear, just surprise. She had never imagined this moment, never dared to. But she placed her hand in his and let him lead her to the floor. His touch was steady, gentle, familiar, yet new. They moved together with unspoken ease, the crowd around them blurring into soft colors and music, and though it was a formal dance, there was something unguarded in the way Ethan looked at her now, like the CEO mask had slipped, like the world he kept behind glass was cracking open just enough for her to step inside. His hand rested on the small of her back, not out of propriety, not to guide, but to hold. And in that subtle, quiet gesture, Charlotte felt something unspoken pass between them. Not strategy, not expectation, but recognition. She was no longer just Ethan Stone's assistant. She was Charlotte, the woman who had quietly kept his world spinning for 6 years, the woman who had spent too long hiding in plain sight, and now the woman who stood at the center of a room she once felt unworthy of. And he saw her, truly. As the music swelled and dipped, they moved in sync, two people who had shared countless days, but never shared this, never allowed the space between them to become something more than professional. Yet now, in this moment, under the shimmering light, everything felt different. No words were exchanged, none were needed, because for the first time, Charlotte wasn't playing a role. She wasn't pretending. She felt real. Some moments live with you, long after the lights go out. Monday came like it always did, without apology. The sun rose over downtown Dallas, golden and quiet, but inside the glass tower of Stone Capitol, everything hummed with practiced rhythm. Phones ringing, coffee brewing, shoes clicking against polished marble. Charlotte walked into the office at 7:58, 2 minutes early like always, but nothing felt like always. Not the way her heels echoed in the hallway, not the way her heart thudded harder than it should have, not the quiet weight of last Saturday still lingering on her shoulders like the soft scent of the perfume she'd worn that night. Everything was the same, except her. At her desk, she opened her laptop, fingers moving on instinct. Calendar, emails, to-do list. It was all there, but her mind wasn't. It was back in the ballroom, in the silence before the music began, in the weight of Ethan's hand on her back, in the way his eyes had held hers, not as a CEO, not as a man checking off a social obligation, but as someone seeing her, moment by moment. Now, 2 days later, it all felt like a vivid dream left out in the sun too long, blurred, softened. And Ethan, he hadn't mentioned it, not once. He'd walked in that morning with his usual stride, nodded her way, given a brief morning, Charlotte, before disappearing behind the glass wall of his office. That was it. No comment about the gala, no reflection, no anything. Charlotte tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that it was just a work function, that maybe he was just being professional. But it did matter, because for the first time, she'd let herself hope, not for some whirlwind romance, not even for acknowledgement, just for something real. A thread of continuity between who she was that night and who she was now. Instead, it felt like the ballroom had closed behind her, like the music had stopped and she was the only one still hearing it. Around mid-morning, the courier arrived a small stack of business journals, magazines, and press packets. As usual, they were placed on Charlotte's desk to be sorted and flagged for Ethan. She flipped through them quickly. Articles on market trends, global stocks, leadership spotlights, and then she froze. There it was, Southern Business Weekly, a glossy black and gold cover, and right in the center, a photograph of Ethan and Charlotte mid-dance. He in a sharp black tuxedo, she in that black gown that now felt like part of her skin, their eyes locked, his hand on her back, her expression calm, luminous. Stone Capitol CEO, seen with mystery, partner at gala, the headline read, "Who is the elegant woman by his side?" Charlotte stared at it, pulse pounding. She hadn't seen a photographer that night, not really, but of course they had been there. Of course someone noticed. Of course. This would follow her. Part of her wanted to hide it. Another part, one she barely recognized, wanted to frame it. But she did neither. Instead, she slipped the magazine into the folder for Ethan, right on top, as she always did. Routine was a comfort she still clung to. Minutes passed. An hour. Then his office door opened. She glanced up quickly, heart jumping. Ethan walked out, holding the folder in one hand, the magazine visible under his thumb. He didn't speak, just walked past her desk, eyes not meeting hers, as though his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. Then he paused, still facing away. He lifted the magazine slightly, as if to be sure. And then he turned the page, deliberately, quietly, without a word. Charlotte sat perfectly still. The air around her felt thinner somehow, her throat dry. What did that mean? That it didn't matter, that it did. But he wouldn't say it. A flicker of something long buried stirred in her chest, an old ache she knew too well. The ache of wanting more than someone was willing to give. She turned back to her screen, typed a line, deleted it. Then she reached for her notebook, flipped to a blank page, and began writing just her own name, over and over, as if grounding herself in something certain, because, one way or another, she had changed. The night hadn't been a dream. She had danced. She had been seen, and even if Ethan never spoke of it again, she would not forget. When one door closes, another often opens, but some doors are traps, not paths. The day after the gala had ended with silence. The day after that came with questions. But it was on the third day, just as Charlotte was beginning to tuck the memory of Saturday night back into its quiet box, that the email came. Subject, Coffee GB. She didn't need to guess who GB was. Gavin Blake, CEO of Blake & Rowe, Ethan's longtime business rival, and the kind of man who walked into a room like he already owned the air. He had smiled at her at the gala just briefly, but there had been something calculating in his eyes, like he was taking notes. Now, he wanted to meet. Just coffee, he said, just a conversation. Charlotte hesitated. She wasn't naive. She'd heard how Gavin operated: clever, charming, opportunistic. A man who smiled with his mouth, but rarely with his eyes. Still, curiosity tugged at her. She chose a quiet coffee shop in the Arts District, neutral. Understated. No white tablecloths or name-dropping baristas. A place where people could talk and still be themselves, if they tried hard enough. He arrived precisely on time, tall, polished, wearing a suit that probably cost as much as her rent, but no tie, as if to say, I'm important, but approachable. His smile was disarming, too practiced to be warm, but not unkind. Charlotte, he said smoothly, offering his hand. You're even more poised in daylight. She raised an eyebrow. I'm assuming this isn't about the cappuccino. He chuckled and slid into the seat across from her. No, though I hear the croissants are worth the trip. He placed a leather folio on the table, black, sleek, embossed with silver initials. He didn't open it yet. Just let it sit there like a silent guest. I'll be honest, Gavin began. I've been watching you. Not in a creepy way, he added quickly, but professionally. You're sharp, organized, and frankly, you're far too talented to be answering phones and managing someone else's calendar. Charlotte bristled slightly. I don't just manage calendars. He smiled. I know. That's why I'm here. He finally opened the folder and slid a document across the table. A job offer. Thick, high-quality paper. Real money. Strategic Communications Director, Blake & Rowe Investments. Full leadership authority. Double her current salary, profit sharing, a team of 5 reporting directly to her. Charlotte blinked. It wasn't flattery. It was serious. You're offering me this. Absolutely, Gavin said. You've been hiding in plain sight, Charlotte. The gala just made that obvious. She looked down at the paper, heart pounding. You saw something in me. After one event, I saw how Ethan looked at you, he said, not unkindly, and I saw how you carried yourself with intelligence, grace. The room noticed. Charlotte, people are still talking. She bit her lip, and Gavin shrugged. That's exactly the point, isn't it? Has he said anything, done anything? She didn't answer. I know Ethan, Gavin continued. We were classmates, competitors. I've seen how he handles things he can't control. Meaning. He leaned in slightly. He doesn't let emotions complicate the brand. And you? Charlotte, you're complicated, in a good way, but he'll never bring you fully into the light. Not unless he absolutely has to. His voice softened. You deserve more than that. The words struck a nerve she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Charlotte had spent years keeping her head down, blending into the fabric of a company that needed her but never quite saw her. For one night, she'd stepped into the light, and it had felt terrifyingly beautiful. But now she wasn't sure if she was meant to return to the shadows. Why do you want me? She asked quietly. What do you really get out of this? Gavin didn't blink. Results. Blake and Rowe need someone like you. Someone who gets the subtleties, who can manage both people and perception, and I know talent when I see it. He paused. Plus, I don't mind if offering you this position stings Stone a little. There it was, the game beneath the offer, the rivalry, simmering and sharp, and I'm not interested in being a pawn in a feud, she said, her tone calm but firm. Gavin smiled again. And that's why you'd never be one. You'd have power, autonomy, respect. You'd walk in through the front door, not the service elevator. Charlotte stared at the contract. The paper felt heavier than it should. So did the silence in her chest. She thought of Ethan's hand at the small of her back, of the way he had looked at her then, and then not again, of how he had turned the page instead of speaking, of how she had waited for something, anything that hadn't come. Maybe Gavin was wrong, but maybe he wasn't. Still, something in her wasn't ready to sign away what hadn't yet been named. She looked up. Thank you for the offer. I mean that. I'll think about it. That's all I ask, Gavin said, standing, adjusting his cuffs. But Charlotte. She met his gaze. You deserve to be chosen, not just kept. He walked out, leaving the air colder than before. Alone. Charlotte folded the contract carefully, placed it in her bag, but didn't look at it again. Not yet. But her fingers lingered on the leather flap longer than they needed to. The hardest thing is not being rejected, it's being invisible after you've finally shown up. The steady hum of the office air conditioning was the only sound Charlotte could hear that morning, though the hallway outside her desk bustled with its usual rhythm. Phones rang, printers hissed. Laughter from the sales department echoed faintly across the floor. But in Charlotte's world, everything was quiet. She sat at her desk, staring blankly at a spreadsheet she'd reviewed twice already. Nothing was wrong with the numbers. Everything was wrong with her heart. 3 days had passed since the gala. 3 long, echoing days since Ethan had placed his hand gently on the small of her back, guiding her into the ballroom as if she belonged. Since they had danced under golden chandeliers, and she had felt like more than someone in the background. But come Monday, Ethan Stone had gone quiet again. He hadn't mentioned the gala. Not a word. not a glance that lasted longer than necessary. Just meetings, memos, and that unreadable look he wore like armor. And now, as Charlotte watched the second hand of the office clock tick forward, she felt something inside her shift. She could not pretend anymore. She had lived for too long in the in-between, not seen, not invisible, not chosen, not dismissed. A maybe, a perhaps. A woman paused in mid-sentence, waiting for someone to finish the thought. No more. She stood up, with calm precision. Charlotte smoothed her skirt and picked up the small envelope she had written the night before. The words inside had taken hours to find, but only one line remained. She walked toward his office. The door was ajar. Ethan looked up from his computer when she knocked once, softly. "Charlotte," he said, voice neutral. "Come in." She closed the door behind her. It clicked gently into place, more final than she meant it to sound. "I need a moment," she said, her voice low but sure. Ethan nodded. He leaned back in his chair, searching her face. She didn't sit. "I want to know what that night meant to you," she said, "because to me, it wasn't just a dress or a dance. It wasn't about being seen by a room full of people. It was about finally being seen by you." He flinched, just slightly. "I thought maybe something had shifted," she continued, "that maybe, for once, I was more than your assistant, that there was something real. But then, Monday came, and Tuesday, and nothing." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Charlotte waited, and waited. Finally, he said, "I didn't mean to hurt you. That's not an answer." He looked away. "It's complicated," he said at last. Her breath hitched. "No, Ethan, it's actually not. I have responsibilities," he said, standing now. "Stone Capital is stop." Her voice was firmer than she expected. "This isn't about Stone Capital. This is about you. About whether you feel anything real or if I was just convenient." Convenient. He looked pained. "You think that's what this is?" She didn't back down. "I think if it were real, you'd have said something by now." A pause. Then Charlotte, "I don't know how to do this. I've never—" "You don't have to know how," she interrupted gently. "You just have to want to." But he stayed silent. And in that silence, Charlotte saw everything she needed to know. She reached into her bag, pulled out the envelope, and placed it on his desk. "I'm resigning," she said quietly. Ethan stared at the envelope, then at her. "Don't," he said, finally. "Please, I have to." "Is this because of Gavin?" His voice hardened. "No," she said, shaking her head. "This is because of me." She inhaled deeply. "I've spent most of my adult life doing what's expected. Taking care of my brother, working behind the scenes, holding everything together while letting myself unravel quietly." She looked him straight in the eye. "But I've remembered something lately. Who I used to be, who I still am. And that woman, she's not going to be hidden anymore." Ethan stepped closer. His voice dropped. "Charlotte, I never meant for this to be cruel." "I know," she whispered, "but kindness without clarity is still hurtful." She turned to leave, her steps unhurried, deliberate, and for once, she didn't feel like she was being pushed away. She was walking out on her own terms. At the door, she paused, her hand on the knob. Without looking back, she said softly, "I won't disappear again." The door closed with a soft finality behind her. Ethan remained frozen, eyes locked on the envelope. The room, once filled with strategy and silence, now felt like it was missing its center. With hesitant fingers, he opened the letter. Inside, written in her graceful, steady hand, was just one line: "I won't disappear again." Sometimes love is not loud. It waits. but when it speaks, it changes everything. Ethan Stone sat alone in his office, the envelope still open beside him. He'd read the note again and again, just one sentence. But it echoed louder than any boardroom speech he'd ever given. I won't disappear again. His eyes stung, though he told himself it was just lack of sleep. The reality was harder to face. Charlotte hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't begged. She had simply walked away with quiet dignity and a spine of steel, and in doing so, left a silence he didn't know how to fill. All morning, he'd tried to work, tried to focus, but every glance at her empty desk felt like a missing breath. She had been there for 6 years, 6 years of calendars aligned to perfection, flights rescheduled before delays. Conference calls that never clashed, gift baskets to clients chosen with personal touches he never even noticed until now. The things she did, the way she did them, it had never been just a job to her. It had been care, devotion, perhaps even love, long before he was ready to recognize it. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Images rushed in her laughter at the gala, the way her eyes lit up during their dance, the tremble in her voice when she said, "I thought maybe something had shifted." It had, but he hadn't had the courage to admit it, and now she was gone. He opened his phone, searching. It didn't take long to find it. New Haven Green Strategic Pitch Event, 1:00 p.m. Gavin Blake's logo sat smugly at the bottom. Ethan stood. He didn't plan what he would say. He didn't call ahead. He just left. At the event hall downtown, the room was already filling with investors, executives, and community leaders. Charlotte stood at the front, a simple navy dress hugging her frame, hair tucked behind one ear, her voice calm and poised as she clicked through a slideshow about sustainability and urban redevelopment. Ethan stood at the back, unnoticed at first, but he noticed everything. The way her posture held confidence now, the way she smiled not politely, but freely, the way Gavin leaned just a little too close as she spoke. Ethan didn't interrupt. He waited until she finished her final slide and the room gave polite applause. Then, before she could step down, he moved forward. His footsteps were the only sound for a moment. Chairs creaked, heads turned. Charlotte looked up and her breath caught. She hadn't expected him. Not here. Not now. Ethan took the floor without invitation. His voice was quiet, steady, but it carried. "If I may," he said, turning to the crowd, "I'd like to say something, not as a CEO, but as someone who made a mistake." Gavin narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. Ethan turned his gaze to Charlotte. "I underestimated someone," he said. "For years." A hush fell. She wasn't just the woman behind the meetings and emails. She was the woman who held everything together, not just with skill, but with heart. He took one more step toward her. "I was afraid to be seen, truly seen. Because when you let someone in that deeply, they have the power to change everything." He paused. And she did. Charlotte stood frozen, her throat tight, eyes shimmering. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, this one heavier, formal, embossed. "I came here not to take you away," he said, holding it out, "but to offer you something you should have had long ago." She opened it slowly. Inside, a letter of appointment as strategic director. Partner. Equal. No longer an assistant. No longer behind the curtain. A pause filled the space between them. Then Charlotte looked up, really looked, and something in her eyes softened. She folded the paper carefully, fingers trembling ever so slightly. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like," Ethan said, "but I want to find out with you beside me." "Not behind me." Another silence. But this one wasn't empty. It was full of things finally spoken. Charlotte smiled, small at first, then blooming across her face. Not a smile of victory, but of recognition, of yes. And across the room, a woman who once lived in the shadows now stood bathed in light, choosing her future on her terms. There comes a moment when you stop hiding, not because the world changes, but because you have. The early afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the Stone Capitol Event Center, casting soft amber light on the polished marble floor. The space buzzed with anticipation. Investors, press, city officials, and employees all gathered for the public unveiling of Stone Capitol's most ambitious project to date, New Haven Green. But amidst the chatter and the clicking of heels, Charlotte stood in the quiet corridor just off stage, her hands folded around a stack of note cards she no longer needed. She had rehearsed the speech a dozen times, in the mirror, in the car, lying awake at night, and yet, now that the moment had arrived, the words no longer mattered as much as the why behind them. Ethan's voice came softly behind her. "They're ready." She turned slightly, and there he was in a slate-gray suit, no tie, a small crooked smile she had come to recognize not just as charm, but reassurance. "You're going to be incredible," he added, simply. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past him, through the curtain, at the room filling with people she once would have felt invisible among. But today, she had earned her place there. She nodded, exhaling slow and steady. "Let's do this." The stage lights were warm, but not blinding. The moment her heels touched the wooden platform, the crowd hushed. A soft breeze from the ceiling vents brushed her cheek, grounding her. A host introduced her, but Charlotte barely heard it. Her eyes scanned the crowd, familiar faces, unfamiliar ones, and just to the side, behind the last row of chairs, stood Ethan, not seated at the center like a CEO hungry for spotlight. He stood in the wings exactly where she had spent most of her professional life. And now, he was watching her take the center. "Good afternoon," Charlotte began, her voice low but confident. "I'm Charlotte Bennett. I've worked at Stone Capitol for 6 years, and for most of those years, I was invisible." A pause. Soft murmurs rippled across the room. "I booked flights. I fetched coffee. I rechecked presentation slides at midnight. I reminded people to eat lunch. I remembered birthdays others forgot." She let that sit for a moment. I was in the background of every milestone until one day I realized I didn't want to live my life on mute anymore. A breath, and then she lifted her chin. New Haven Green is more than a real estate project. It's a belief that people, no matter their income, background, or story, deserve dignity, green spaces, safety, access to beauty, and above all, the chance to belong. She shared stories of growing up with her single mom in a rental apartment that flooded every spring, of walking her little brother to school and wishing there was a park nearby, of watching her mother save up for curtains because she believed even the smallest window deserved softness. The audience leaned in because it wasn't just a pitch, it was a remembering. Charlotte finished with quiet conviction. "This isn't about buildings. It's about people. And I am proud, deeply proud, to be part of something that makes space for them." Applause, rising, earnest. She stepped back from the podium, heart pounding but in the best way, like it had been held back for years and was finally free to beat in full. And then, to her surprise, Ethan walked on stage. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked at her, not through her, at her, with something between awe and apology in his gaze. Then he turned to the microphone. "I wasn't supposed to speak today," he said with a quiet smile. This was Charlotte's moment, and honestly, it still is. The crowd chuckled, but I needed to say something, because what you saw here wasn't just a great presentation, it was the heart of this company. He turned back to her. She's not just my colleague. She's not just the mind behind New Haven Green. She is without question the best decision I've ever made. A stillness swept the room. Not because it was shocking, but because it was true. Ethan reached out his hand. And Charlotte didn't hesitate. She took it. He leaned in, slowly, respectfully, and in the center of a public event, in front of a room full of power suits and lenses and long memories, Ethan Stone pressed a soft, certain kiss to her lips. It wasn't about drama or spectacle. It was about truth. A truth whispered between late nights and quiet glances and 6 years of not quite seeing. Now, finally, here it was out in the open. The applause that followed wasn't explosive. It was warm, gentle, knowing. Because the people watching weren't witnessing scandal or surprise. They were witnessing recognition. Afterward, backstage, Charlotte sat in the quiet lounge, her hands resting on her lap, still trembling faintly. Ethan joined her, carrying 2 glasses of water. He handed one to her. "You okay?" She looked over at him. "I'm more than okay," she said, and for the first time, she wasn't just saying it, she meant it. At the end of it all, it wasn't the dress, the job, or even the kiss. It was who she saw in the mirror when she finally looked without fear. 3 months had passed since that night on stage, the night when Charlotte Bennett stopped hiding. It was a strange thing, she thought. How life didn't dramatically shift overnight like in the movies. There were no flashing headlines, no whirlwind of interviews. Instead, the change was quiet, but deep, like roots finally taking hold after years of drifting. She was now the director of communications at Stone Capital, a role she had been unofficially doing for years, just without the title or recognition. Only this time, she had both. And more than that, she had presence. Each morning, she arrived at the office not as someone blending into the wallpaper, but as someone who owned her space. She greeted team members by name. She made decisions that mattered. She led meetings where once she had only taken notes. People listened when she spoke, not just because of what she said, but because they could feel her standing tall in her own truth. Charlotte no longer wore gray cardigans that hung like a question mark. Now, her wardrobe still leaned towards simplicity, but it carried intention-clean lines, thoughtful cuts, soft fabrics that moved with her. She didn't dress to disappear anymore. And as for Ethan, well, he had changed too. He still worked hard, still chased excellence, but he'd begun to understand that success wasn't only measured in numbers or market share. It was also the way he stayed late, not because he had to, but to walk Charlotte to her car. It was how he started keeping a photo of his sister, long past, on his desk again, something he had tucked away for years. It was how he now took one full Saturday each month and turned off his phone completely. They'd spend those days in antique bookstores, farmers markets, or simply walking around White Rock Lake, hands intertwined, the world quiet. Ethan Stone had built an empire, but now he was building a life. On an early spring morning, Charlotte stood alone in her apartment, sunlight pooling on the old oak floors. She was getting ready for Stone Capital's first official community open house, a casual event, nothing fancy, but it marked something meaningful. It was the first time Charlotte would speak publicly, not just as an executive, but as herself, without anything to prove. She stepped in front of her full-length mirror, the same mirror where, years ago, she'd learned to lower her eyes, avoid too much time staring. But today, she paused and looked. No makeup yet, hair still slightly tousled, No high heels or press-worthy outfit. Just her in soft jeans and a linen blouse, barefoot, holding a cup of tea. And in the reflection, a woman she recognized. There were faint lines near her eyes now, not from stress but from smiling more. Her shoulders were more relaxed, her gaze steady, and somewhere deep in that gaze, she saw not just confidence, she saw peace. She thought of her younger self, the girl who stayed home from prom to help her little brother build his science project, the woman who never bought the graduation dress because the rent was due, the assistant who answered emails at midnight and never once asked to be seen. She'd done so much for others, but today she had done something for herself. She had stayed, not just at the company, not just in the relationship, but in herself. Later that afternoon, the community event buzzed with laughter, children running through model displays, local artists showcasing work on temporary panels. There were no suits, no investors, just people. Charlotte stood with Ethan, watching it all unfold. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think leadership meant standing out front." She glanced at him. He continued, "But you've shown me that sometimes. Leadership is standing beside someone, or even behind them, so they feel strong enough to walk forward." She smiled. "You're not so bad at metaphors these days." He chuckled. "I've had a good teacher." Just then, a little girl ran by with a balloon, her laughter ringing through the air. Ethan reached over and gently brushed a strand of hair from Charlotte's face. "This is what I want more of," he whispered. "Not stages or press or gala nights. Just this. You. Us." Charlotte didn't answer right away. She just reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly. No fireworks, no speeches, just truth. That evening, long after the crowd had gone and the sun had dipped below the horizon, Charlotte returned home. She moved through her apartment slowly, the scent of lavender from a candle, the soft hum of jazz on her old stereo. Before turning in, she stepped once more in front of her mirror. She studied herself. And this time, she didn't see a former assistant, or the woman from the magazine cover, or even the successful communications director. She saw a woman who had fought quietly, fiercely for the right to take up space, to be heard, to be chosen, and, most importantly, to choose herself. She smiled, not the smile of someone performing, but the smile of someone coming home. Sometimes, we become so used to blending into the background in our families, our jobs, even our own hearts, that we forget we were never meant to disappear. Charlotte's story reminds us that it's never too late to step into the light, not for praise, not for glamour, but to reclaim the quiet dignity of being seen. This isn't a tale about falling in love with someone powerful. It's about remembering the power we've always had the strength to show up fully, even when the world overlooks us. We live many lives in one lifetime, and some chapters, especially the quieter ones, are where we grow the most. Sometimes all it takes is a moment, an invitation, a choice, a glance to awaken the version of ourselves we'd long forgotten. So, if you've ever felt invisible, remember you are still here. You are still worthy, and you never needed permission to be seen. May this story remind us all at any age that becoming visible is not about changing who we are. It's about having the courage to become who we've always been. Thank you for spending your precious time with us. If this story touched your heart even just a little, we'd be truly grateful if you gave it a like, shared it with someone who might need it, and subscribed for more soulful stories like this. Every comment, every click, every kind word helps us keep telling the stories that matter. Until next time, take care and keep shining.